Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 12th of July of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates. Today the most important updates are coming from the Black Sea. We have the explosions on the Snake Island. We have some interesting situation in the vicinity of Kherson. We have more videos from Bradley Square of destroyed Ukrainian armored vehicles. And right before we start making this video, the sources reported that the real and biggest tank battle have started. We have a lot of videos from Donetsk frontline. We have a lot of interesting updates from Kupiansk, Liman, and of course we have very interesting things to discuss and to think about the end of the NATO summit and so on. And before we start, I would like to start with the NATO summit. So as you know, a lot of people these days visited Lithuania, Vilnius. There was a NATO summit, and a lot of Western leaders visited this small Baltic state. Joe Biden visited, the Olaf Scholz, Zelensky, and many other people, Emmanuel Macron and Sunak visited. So a lot of people were there, and we saw a real show of the things that happened in this settlement. I believe you saw a lot of interesting pictures of standalone Zelensky that nobody wanted to talk with him. I believe you heard reports from the Western countries and from the media that Zelensky was trying to force the Western countries to give him some guarantees that Ukraine is going to become part of NATO, and that the Western countries, including United States of America and Germany, blocked that request, and they removed this paragraph of this situation from the final statement of this meeting. A lot of things, and I discussed this situation with my team, and I was trying to understand their opinion, and I got the next opinion. My team reported me and told me that Zelensky was depressed. That situation is terrible, that Ukrainians are not going to receive anything from Western countries, and basically he returned with nothing to Ukraine. And you know that my team is international, and these people I was talking with don't know Zelensky as I know. For example, I'm living in Belarus, and Zelensky, his native language is Russian, and he used to be significant comedian. He is an actor. He's a very nice actor, and he had in the past, when he was like an actor, he had a lot of shows, TV shows, mainly comedies and so on. And he always played the main roles in those films, movies, and TV shows and so on. And during the years when I was following him when he was an actor, I understood something about him. And when I saw yesterday's entire situation with the visit of Zelensky of Vilnius, when he came to this country, when he published his personal article before visiting, when he was saying that he started blaming NATO, that they refused to support him, those standalone photos with him, those messages from the Western sources about that Biden was very angry that Zelensky tried to force the Western countries to allow Ukraine to join NATO. And you know what I saw? I haven't seen a real life. I haven't seen the real situation. I haven't seen Zelensky to be depressed. But the thing that I saw was a real drama. That was a real movie. And that was a drama, that was a movie with a part of a hope, with everything that is important when you're making a movie. And when I was following Zelensky, I didn't saw a real person. I saw an actor who played his role significantly. And he was the main player, the main actor in that movie by the name of NATO Summit. And currently, I follow the Russian Telegram channels, Russian segment of internet and so on, and I see that people from Russia who supports Russia are very happy with the results of the NATO summit. They are very happy that Ukrainians are not going to join NATO, that not just not going to join NATO, the Ukrainians haven't received even a real plan what they need to do and what they need to complete to join NATO. And basically, as I understand, this is exactly what the Western countries wanted the Russian segment of internet to believe in. Because we saw just the thing that we were allowed to see. We saw just the show, the drama, I believe so, with those significant actors like Zelensky, Biden, Scholz, and many others about the situation with Ukraine. And we were allowed to see this. And nobody knows exactly what exactly was discussed, which documents were signed somewhere below the scene, somewhere below the TV cameras, somewhere underground in the basements and so on. And as I understand, I believe that Zelensky was promised everything. He was promised to receive more support. He was promised to be received more weapon. He was promised about everything: finance, support, even, I don't know, mercenaries, volunteers, everything. And the thing that I understand, that this war is going to continue, and probably this war is not going to be ended this year. And these guys are going to fight not even maybe till the last Ukrainian, but maybe even till the last, I don't know, European citizen or something like this. Currently, everything was resolved, and we saw just the drama for us to think, to force us to think that Ukrainians are not going to become a part of NATO this year. And this is exactly what they wanted us to believe in. Now let's start with the situation on the ground. Today, the United States of America sent this RQ-4B Global Hawk in the Black Sea. He was flying above the Black Sea, and currently we understand that soon we need to expect another attack against Crimea using the Ukrainian drones. And as I understand, and this situation is tightly connected with the situation in the vicinity of Snake Island, today the Russians, for the first time probably since the signing of the grain deal, started bombing these islands again. So, and basically the Russians were attacking and bombing these islands using the Su-34 aircrafts and of course drones. So as I understand, the Russians are not using missiles against these islands, because to use missiles against these islands is very expensive. It's too expensive. So that's why the Russians also have military economy, military finance. They understand that these islands is not so important, but they need to show that they control this island. And for these purposes, as I understand, the Russians have redeployed their Su-34 aircrafts in the vicinity of our airfield of Novofyodorovka. And basically from this Novofyodorovka airfield, the Russians were bombing that island, and they will continue bombing this island exactly from this territory. And that was the reason why the United States of America have redeployed their Global Hawk, and currently this Global Hawk tried to spot and try to control the Russian air forces in that airport. And they just want to control when is the best time for the Ukrainians to launch their missiles and drone attacks from Odessa in that direction. So basically this is exactly the situation that currently is happening, and this night, I believe so, we're going to see if the Russians are not going to redeploy their aircrafts back to the mainland. The Ukrainians will use this they will use these possibilities, these chances, and they will strike Crimea one more time, not even just with the drones, but also with the Storm Shadow missiles. Now we're moving to Kherson. Today the Russians published a lot of videos from this bridgehead. Basically they confirmed, not one more time, they confirmed that they were forced to step back. They published the video how they were bombing the ex-hotel. This is the drone, and the Russians claims that using that attack they were trying to destroy machine gun position. And this is the same video but from another angle, and the same drone, but another drone was making a video of that drone attack. The Russians haven't provided any piece of information regarding the results of that attack, whether they were able to destroy machine gun position or not. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fighting artillery duels on Kherson bridgehead, the Ukrainians lost 40 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems M777 howitzers. Now we're moving to Zaporizhzhia front line, and first we're going to start with Petykhatki area. The Ukrainians during the day made few attempts to attack this settlement with the small commandos reconnaissance groups. All those attempts were repelled, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back to Lapkova bridgehead for regrouping. Tomorrow they will continue using the same tactics. Now we're we're moving to the Rabotina. There are very fierce fightings, and we continue receiving a lot of more videos from this bridgehead. The Ukrainians continue losing their armored vehicles, their Bradleys, their tanks on this bridgehead. The Russians published another video. They published the video of the entire and the real cemetery of Ukrainian armored vehicles. As you can see, there are a lot of tanks, a lot of armored vehicles on the horizon. So this is a real cemetery of the Western weapon. Furthermore, there was another video of a real episode of attack. The Ukrainian light vehicle was heading to the combat line, but this light vehicle was discovered by the Russian artillery and the Russian forces and was destroyed during the small pause or something like this. Furthermore, the Russians published the video how they managed to capture completely repaired and ready to go Bradley somewhere in this area. But the thing is that Ukrainians continue sending more and more forces in this area. Basically, the Ukrainians are using the following tactics. No matter the situation that they managed to clear most of the fields on the north, the Russians continue using the distance mining method, and the Ukrainians still continue using this road that goes from Orekhova to Rabotina, and the Ukrainians are landing or moving their forces somewhere to this bridgehead, somewhere to this area. I will mark with the cloud. And after that, as soon as the Ukrainians are able to get these positions, the Ukrainians stretch their forces and spread these forces all over the front line. Some tanks and armored vehicles are going to the west, some forces are going to the south, and most of the forces were going and are going currently to the east to support their offensive operation of their forces on this bridgehead. When talking about the Ukrainians, the Russians, they also send a lot of infantry because the Russians know the mining maps in this territory. They don't need to use tanks. The Russians mainly use just regular infantry with anti-tank missiles. And for example, today the Ukrainians published how they managed to discover one of such a group. The Russian platoon was heading to the frontline. As you can see, this video is geolocated. This is anti-tank squad. The Ukrainians managed to discover and started bombing and shelling Russian troopers on their move to this bridgehead. Anyway, some Russian bloggers, military experts, for example, like Rybo, reported that the Russians, as a result of counterattack, managed to return most of the bridgehead, most of the fields. But for now, we are not going to update this map because we need more confirmations, more updates, more like reliable information. But the thing I would like to add that right before we started making this video, at 8 p.m. of the local time, the Russian reliable source Arkhangel Spetsnaz reported that there is, at 8 p.m. of the local time, the parties, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, started a real epic tank battle. So basically, during those days, the Ukrainians were trying to redeploy their armored fists to these fields. The Russians have redeployed their armored fists to the fields as well, and also the Russians have redeployed their anti-tank squads. And currently, right on these fields, there is a real tank battle, not just like one tank against one tank. I believe that there are squads or even platoons of tanks against each other are fighting for the domination and control over these fields. And basically, as I understand, this is the culmination, this is the highest point of this battle, and who wins the battle, basically this tank battle, will control the entire field and will dominate and will continue offensive operation. It might be the Ukrainians and they will continue attacking Rabotina, or the Russians and they will push the Ukrainians back from these fields, and maybe the Russians will launch a small counteroffensive, but hardly unlikely the Russians are going to do this. Anyway, the Ukrainians were moving the tanks the same way, using the road, and the Russians also published the video. Of course, they control the road, they control this main supply road of the Ukrainians, and the Russians were bombing and shelling this territory. And basically in this video, the Russians claims that as a result of another regrouping and redeployment of Ukrainian forces, 2 personal armored carriers were destroyed somewhere in the forest line, whose main purpose was to secure the flanks from the Russian attack upon the Ukrainian flanks, and those armored vehicles were destroyed under Russian artillery fire. Now we're moving further. Another video we got from Novodanilovka, and the Russians claims that as a result of intelligence reconnaissance operation, they managed to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian tank on the south of Novodanilovka. Maybe this is not a real tank, but it's like a toll, but maybe it's real. For now, it's very difficult to understand. We don't see like the fire and the signs of a real explosion. It might be anything. Now we're moving further to the Avdiivka tactical bridgehead. The Ukrainians continue regrouping with the small attacks using the reconnaissance teams. Most of the attacks were repelled, but the Ukrainians continue accumulation of their forces all over the entire combat line, and they're preparing themselves before another wave of attack. The Russians see this, and of course the Russians try to prevent the Ukrainians' attacks using the flamethrower systems. And for example, on this episode we see how during the night the Russians were trying to bomb and destroy the Ukrainians' positions in Makarovka using the flamethrower systems TOS-1. The sources are saying that there are a lot of updates from Ugledar, that there is a real combat, face-to-face battle from both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians counterattacks, but we still haven't received any video or photo confirmations of those clashes. Now we're moving to Donetsk. Before moving to Donetsk, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings from Petykhatki to Ugledar, the Ukrainians lost 240 soldiers, 19 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems. As you can see, the level of losses is very heavy, and yesterday the Ukrainians lost 90 soldiers, the day before yesterday 150. So we see that there was a real culmination of those battles and clashes on this combat line. Now we're moving to Donetsk, and we got a very interesting video. If you remember, a few days ago we discussed that the military blogger, military expert of Russia, Ryba, reported that the Russians launched a counter-offensive operation on Vadiana bridgehead, and as a result of that attack the Russians managed to maintain the bridgehead and to capture this forest line and to force the Ukrainians to step back in Severna. And after that the Russians claims that they managed to establish fire control over the supply roads that goes from the mainland to Avdiivka. But we haven't received any video or photo confirmations of those clashes, and today the Ukrainians published the video, one episode of the battle of this territory. The main forces that were fighting on the Ukrainian side was the forces of 53rd Mechanized Brigade, this brigade, and basically during that battle the Russians they launched a very powerful attack, very significant attack, using a lot of armored vehicles, a lot of tanks in that operation, a lot of troopers and infantry. But as you can see, the Russians also, some armored vehicles were destroyed, some of them got in minefields. So the Russians managed to return that forest line, but they were forced to pay a significant price for that counterattack. Now we're moving to Donetsk, to Bakhmut frontline, to Artyomovsk area. The Russians launched a counter-offensive operation in the vicinity of Klishchiivka, and as a result of those clashes they managed to force the Ukrainians to step back from every single fortification and every single stronghold around Klishchiivka that stick to the settlement. And currently the Ukrainians were forced to step back to the forest line on the north, northwest and west and south west of this settlement. The Ukrainians published a very interesting video how they continue controlling and bombing the Russian positions inside of Artyomovsk. On this video we see that Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian eye position and just in sniper position, maybe machine gun position, and basically using drones and grenades they were trying to bomb this house and to force the Russians to leave this area. The Russians using this territory for establishing visible and fire control over the residential area that located on the southwest from that building. Also, we got a lot of talks, a lot of rumors about the situation in the vicinity of Berkhovka in this area. The Ukrainians claims that as a result of counterattacks, and some Russian sources confirmed that piece of information, managed to penetrate Russian defense orders, enter this settlement and so on. But today, for example, other Russian sources reported that as a result counterattack, the Russians managed to push the Ukrainians back and so on. But today we got a geolocated video from the Ukrainian side. This is the fresh video, and the Ukrainians claims that using drones they were trying to hit and destroy Russian T-90 tank, and for those purposes the Ukrainians used at least 2 drones, and they haven't managed to deal any damage to the tank. And basically that event took place exactly on this interception of these forest lines. So that means the tank was there and was controlling the fields on the south. So basically, as I understand, Berkhovka is under complete Russian control and there are no more Ukrainians in the western part of this area. We will update this map very soon as we will understand for 100% this information. Very interesting, and I believe the most interesting information, as for me, as for military expert, is coming from the area between Veselye, Belogorovka and Berestova, this area. I'm trying to pay attention to this bridgehead, to these railroad ways for maybe 7th day in a row. The Ukrainians are bombing and shelling this area, and there are too many of the Russians on this along this forest line accumulated along these railroad ways on this area. And basically the Russians have some plans, but for now I don't understand the real Russian plans. Before today we saw the videos how the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions, mainly the troopers, and today the Ukrainians, the forces of 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, published the video of real attempt from the Russian side to attack on these fields using the armored vehicle Fist, not just one vehicle, but a real platoon with tanks and armored vehicles. The Russians were heading to the north in direction let's say in direction of Vyemka and Avdiivka, so right in the back of Ukrainian positions in Sporne. This is a very interesting region. The Ryba, Russian military expert, reported that Ukrainians have redeployed 92nd Mechanized Brigade and something very big is going to happen in this area. But if you ask my opinion, we see maybe during the last week how the Ukrainians were bombing and shelling Russian positions along these railroad ways, and the Russians did have significant losses. I'm not sure that something interesting and something successful can appear from this situation after such a heavy losses from the Russian side. As we discussed, maybe this is the operation of the Russian side to secure the flanks of Sporna while the Russians are trying to storm this settlement from the north. Maybe this is it, and as soon as the Russians are able to achieve some success in Sporna, they will retreat from these positions. But for now we see that there are still a lot of problems in Sporna and the Ukrainians still controls this settlement under the pressure of Russian forces. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of fierce fightings from Donetsk to Siversk bridgehead, the Ukrainians lost 335 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles including 1 tank and 2 artillery systems. Furthermore, the Ministry of Defense reported that the Russians managed to repel 30 attacks all over the combat line, exactly on Donetsk front line. 30, it's a significant number of attacks, and basically that was the heaviest and the strongest day for the Russians' defense operation. Now we are moving to the north, to Liman front line. The Russian sources are saying that after the Russians managed to get the edge positions in Tarskoye yesterday, today they made a very fast regrouping, and currently the Russians are storming this settlement. The Ukrainians are sending more and more reserves to stop the Russians, but basically the Ukrainians lost their possibilities to send the reserves from Zarechny to Tarskoye because these ways and this river is under Russian control, and this area is under Russian control. And the only possible solution for the Ukrainians is to send reserves from the north, from this area. But the Russians, they understand the situation, and the Russians have already established fire control over this road, over this way, over this passage from, let's say, Nevskaya along Zherebets River to Tarskoye, and the Russians are bombing these settlements heavily every single day, making significant damage. And for example, today the Russians published the video how they managed to discover and to spot Ukrainian positions in Nevskaya, this settlement, and after that they made a guided bomb attack using Su-34, as I understand. So anyway, the Ukrainians tried to counterattack, but currently it's very difficult to implement any counter-offensive operation because the fact that every single supply road and attack road is under complete Russian fire control. The Russians also published their offensive operation and storming operation Kremenaya forest. The Russians continue advancing in this area as well because the Ukrainians are stepping back, and currently what Ukrainians are trying to do, they're trying to create another defense line. And currently the Ukrainians are trying to build the defense line somewhere here in this area, not to allow the Russians to continue their offensive operation in direction of Yampol. The Russians understand this as well, and they are trying to do everything they can, but not to allow the Ukrainians to complete the fortifications, because if they are able to build fortifications and strongholds in this area, of course the Russians will be forced to spend a lot of time while cracking these fortifications. The Russians published the video how they destroyed another M777 howitzer in this area using the drone attack, maybe using the Lancet forces. As you can see, the quality of the video is not good, but we see that the Russians destroyed that M77 howitzer using Lancet drone. Yes, using Lancet. Also, the Russians published the video how they were attacking and bombing Ukrainian position during the night. As you can see, a very nice quality of video using the night vision equipment, and the Russians just were bombing and shelling Ukrainian positions. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the total losses of the Ukrainians on Liman frontline were around 60 soldiers, 2 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. Very interesting updates are continue coming from Karmazinovka bridgehead. As we discussed, the Russians managed to cross the river and to establish their bridgehead. For now, this territory is completely covered with the fog of war. It's very difficult to understand which hills the Russians managed to capture, but the only thing we know for sure is that Ukrainians are launching another wave by wave of counter attacks, trying to push the Russians from this bridgehead, because they understand the value and the risks of this bridgehead if the Russians can hold this territory. And today the Russians published more videos of another episode of that counter attack, that Ukrainians were moving through the fields, and the most interesting is that these fields are not mined. You see how easy the Ukrainians are trying to cross the fields. They're not mined. The Russians understand this, that this area is not mined, and this is the best and perfect situation for them to establish bridgehead, to move tanks, and to continue offensive operation to the west. Because the tanks have possibilities to implement this, because the fields are not mined. Furthermore, the Russians published a video how they were attacking and bombing the Ukrainian reserves that Ukrainians were sending to this bridgehead to slow down the Russian movements. And as I understand, the Ukrainians was trying to accumulate some forces in this forest, or maybe the Ukrainians were trying to make the same operation to cross the river and to attack Novovodiana, or maybe they were planning to attack the Russians from the south in their southern flank, but the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian accumulation of the forces, and they basically erased that forest from the ground, bombing this forest with all types of weapons they have, with flamethrower systems, with artillery shells, and the Ukrainian forces that were accumulated in that forest probably were completely destroyed. And when talking about Kupiansk front line, there are no changes, just we got a report this morning that the Russians managed to advance as well, but we haven't received any video or photo confirmation of that. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that Ukrainians lost 40 soldiers on this area. Very interesting update we got from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation today. They reported, the Igor Konashenikov reported that Wagner's complete the transfer of their weapon to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, and as a result of that transferring, the Wagner's moved to Ministry of Defense around 2,000 armored vehicles, around 20,000 pieces of light infantry weapon, a lot of artillery shells, and so on. And some people are saying that probably Wagner's are going to be closed or something like this. Why they're transferring weapon? I'll explain to you as I understand the situation. First of all, Wagner's have signed a contract with the Ministry of Defense, as I understand. And basically, if you sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense, that means that all your weapon, all your tanks, all your artillery systems, everything you have is going to be, signed and written, is going to be written on the balance of the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. They need this weapon to have on their balance. They need this weapon to have on their balance for one purpose, to know exactly the standards and the number of equipment, shell and service, servicing that they need to provide to this weapon. So this is the situation. Wagner's are not going to be closed. This is just a regular, let's say, accounting staff, nothing more, just accounting staff. When there is union of two companies, one company became part of a very big company, and currently the assets of one company were moved to the balance of another company. That's it. So it's like a simple attempt to explain as I understand the situation. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.